IELTS Cast, episode 34.
You're listening to IELTS Cast, the podcast that puts you in touch with successful IELTS candidates from around the world. Listen and learn as they explain how they achieved Band 7, 8 and even 9. Now, here's your host, Ryan.
Hello and welcome to IELTS Cast. Today I'm speaking with Sarojini, an IELTS candidate from Hyderabad, India, who's been in the US for the past 3 years in Denver. Sarojini scored an overall of 8.5 on her IELTS, a very amazing score. She had band 8 in listening and reading and band 8.5 in writing and speaking. And she's been kind enough to share a few minutes with us today to explain how she got such incredible marks. So hello, Sarojini. Welcome to IELTS Cast.
Thank you, Ryan. It was really nice talking to you.
Sarojini, let's just talk about you and provide everyone a bit of a profile of who you are. What's your connection to the IELTS? Why did you take the exam?
So my part of the reason for test taking is because I wanted to immigrate to Canada. So I've taken IELTS for the immigration purposes. So I've taken the general training part of the IELTS.
Okay, and how many times did you take the exam?
This is my very first attempt.
Now, what's your connection to English? Have you been speaking it your entire life? Did you study in English?
Having been born and brought up in India, we were taught English from a very early stage. So ever since we were in college, English has been our primary mode of communication.
Right.
So my schooling, my college, everything was in English. So English was not really new to me.
Yeah.
But I think for the speaking part of it, probably because, I always used to speak, most times at least, the grammatically correct English. But sometimes the way the certain words had to be pronounced, that probably I learned after coming to the US and having spent about 3 years in the US. So pronunciation did change a little after coming here. But I think when it comes to actually speaking English, that's probably had been there even when I was in India.
I see. Okay, now let's get to talking about your performance in the IELTS. Maybe we can start with the listening section, and you scored band 8. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you went about preparing for that section of the exam?
Sure. Initially, when I started preparing for IELTS, the listening section, I used to have a recording being played on my system and I had my headphones. So that is how I started preparing because I had given GMAT in the past. So the environment for GMAT is totally different when it comes to IELTS. It's totally different. So even the writing part, I used to type it out in a system for GMAT. So that is how I thought IELTS was going to be until about 4 or 5 days from my exam date.
Oh.
That is when I called up the exam center. And then I actually had them tell me how they were going to conduct the exam in itself. So they told me that the listening part was just going to be played in a room. So it was just going to be out of a speaker in the room, and all the candidates were just going to listen to it and answer in a sheet of paper. So it was not going to be in a system with your headphones plugged on, and that was not how it was going to be. So once I got to learn that part, I realized, okay, I have to actually mimic the exam environment to be sure I can do it, because all these days I had earphones plugged into my ears and I was just very concentrated when I was doing my listening part. So that was not how it was going to work.
So let me just see if I've got the story right. So you actually were not familiar with the format of the examination until a couple of days before.
Right.
Okay. So
Yes.
Yeah. So you must have really had to rush to change the way that you were preparing for it.
Right. So I started preparing only 10 days in advance because my husband thought I could just do fairly well, and IELTS was a pretty easy exam for That was what we had in the mind. So, but once I realized how it is going to be, I told him, okay, it is not going to be easy. So it's not just about knowing English or doing something with English, but you actually have to get familiarized with how the exam was going to be and prepare yourself for it. So, so once I realized, think I prepared for about 10 days. So I had to split up my 10 days for 4 sections that we had. I decided for speaking, I did not really need to spend a lot of time. So I actually did mostly like 2.5, 2.5, 2.5, and then the rest of the days I just split between whatever sections I wanted to brush up my preparation on.
Sorry,
So that's how I.
What's 2.5? 2.5 hours, you mean?
2.5 days is what I
I
said.
see.
I mean,
Okay.
I work during the days,
Yep.
so the remaining part of the evening is what I used to spend on preparation.
I see. I see.
Yeah.
So, did practice tests play a role in your preparation strategy?
Definitely, definitely. I must say so because for listening, I was not. I think, of all the sections, the first hurdle for me was definitely listening section of 4. The reason I say, I mean, when I started preparing for IELTS in itself, I was going through all the videos that you had out there in YouTube, and also the interviews that you did with Band 9, Band 8 people. So I was just getting a hold of how they prepared and all. So when I went through listening section, start in one where you said there are different accents of people, and British accent, Australian accent, and Canadian, or any one of these could come for the listening section. So that is what got me into thinking. I can easily follow American accent, but not this. So for some reason, there are some parts of some words that Britishers pronounce differently than Americans. So that is where I had to target first. So I did a lot of, I went through a lot of videos first to differentiate between American and British. So I wanted to be sure I could follow British accent as well. So I started listening to BBC, even their website has lots of videos about reporters reporting something or the other. So I started following a lot of those videos as well. Certain little differences between how the same word is pronounced by an American versus Britisher. So that is the kind of preparation I started with on my, I think, the first day of listening. So wanted to be sure that I can actually follow the accent that is being heard, and making sure that I could actually answer the questions at hand.
I see. And if we just talk about the accents for a second, so spending, you had spent 3 years in the U.S., so obviously the American accent wasn't a problem. What percentage of the British accent would you say gave you a problem? I mean, were there any parts of what you would hear in recordings, with British people speaking, that you couldn't understand?
Definitely, yes. I would say maybe 15% was a trouble for me with the British accent, because at least for me, I would understand most part of it, and then when it comes to a critical word, saying that particular sentence, I would not get that word that they're talking about. And I realized that very word could be the answer for a specific question. So I could not afford to give up on that word. So I wanted to be sure that I understood.
So in the 2.5 days that you committed to the listening, how many practice exams would you say you ran through?
From the exact IELTS exam, like the 40 minutes or the number of passages, I would say I took about 2 of them. That was it. But just to get familiarize myself with the listening component, because I just cannot sit silently I'm not that kind of a person who sits silently and listens to a video for, say, 1.5, 2 minutes and then answer questions. So I'm usually not that type of a person. I speak a lot myself. So it was a little hard for me to sit and concentrate initially. But when you practice, there was one of these websites, I think I picked it out from one of the sources you listed. And there was also a book called Target Band 7. So that is where I started. I thought, because band 7 was my target initially, and I wanted to be sure to be on the safer side, 7.5 in each was my target.
Okay.
That's where I started. Even Target Band 7 lists a lot of resources that we could use. I picked out one of those websites that it listed, and it had several listening components that I could test myself. So I did all of those tests. So they were of 1.5 to 2 minutes and of difficult, of different difficulty levels, easy, medium, hard. So that is where I started. So I did all of. Okay, well, I mean, the first thing, even before I started preparing, I just took a test to assess myself as to where I stand.
Right.
And so there are many websites out there which give an approximate band score. Say out of 40, you get 35, you're close to a band 8, I guess. I tested myself just to be sure. I knew how many questions I had to be right and to get the band I want to be at.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very healthy strategy for people that, especially people that aren't familiar with the IELTS and have never taken it before. You absolutely need to know what your level is, and then when you know what your goal is, you can create a plausible plan to get to that goal. So when you took those practice exams, what sort of scores were you hitting?
I took 2 of them because I could not rely on the first one.
Yep.
I think because the first one was at 7, I guess, the first band I took. And the second test I took, it was 7.5.
Okay.
Yeah, so I knew, that is when I knew I was right at the border. So if I don't really concentrate and prepare, it might just slip and go a little below than what I need.
So now let's talk about the exam experience itself. How did you feel when you were in the examination room?
Oh, yeah. So as I said, that I already knew they were going to play a recording out loud in the room, and you just have to sit and listen to it and answer. So as we're all aware, for listening part, the moment you miss a question, you cannot go back to it and think on it, because there are other questions that you will have to answer, and the recording is still being continued. It's not going to be stopped. So there was one hurdle. I mean, it is very easy for a person to get carried away when you don't answer a question. You try to answer it before you go on to the rest. But for listening component, we have to move on. If you think you did not catch that answer, I would say just leave it and let's move on to the next one, because you cannot afford to lose the rest of your questions for one. So that's what I did. I mean, I knew I missed out. I think at least 1 or 2, definitely. But I just could not afford to lose the rest of them, so I had to move on. The second thing, the hurdle was in writing for me, because usually, since I've been working for 3 years, I've never used a pencil in my life ever since I graduated, probably.
Okay.
So it was very tough to use a pencil and write the listening. I mean, writing itself was not something that I am familiar with, because these days I just sit in front of the system and type whatever I want to.
Yep.
So writing itself was a hurdle. That was the first thing. And secondly, writing with a pencil was definitely a hurdle, because even the pencil nib just breaks on me. I think I had to change my pencil during my exam. So that was definitely a hurdle.
I wanted to ask you, you said that you had listened to previous interviews that I had with other candidates that had done quite well in the listening section. One of the strategies that comes up time and time again is the idea to preview questions before you get to that section. Did you do any of that in your exam?
Yes, definitely that helps, because you know what you look for. Especially even for listening, I wanted to be sure that I read all the questions first, because they do give you a minute, I guess. They do give some time to go through the questions that the recording is going to be played for. So when you read those questions, you get one keyword for each of them. So you know what you are going to concentrate more on, and you know what you have to look for in the listening component. So when the recording is being played, when you get that keyword, you can pay extra attention to be sure that this is the answer for this question. So I have to listen to that more carefully. It definitely helps.
I think, I think that's very important. Did you do any previewing into upcoming sections? So, for example, section 1 tends to be fairly straightforward. It's more or less a dictation of some kind, usually a telephone call, and it's a good way to warm up the candidates and get them ready for the harder sections, like from number 2 onwards. Did you do any previewing during that section of, say, section 2, section 3?
No. I would just concentrate section by section because every question is important to me. So when I'm doing section 1, it is just section 1. I would not bother about section 2 then, because it would just be, I'm a person who gets tensed really easily. I take pressure a lot. So I just tend to ease down myself by going section by section.
I see.
Won't even worry about the next ones until I have to worry about them.
I see. Okay, is there anything else you wanted to share about listening before we move on to reading?
And I think it's for listening component, since the pattern is going to be different. So it's not that a video is played, say, about a community center and you just have questions on it. There are different types as well. So one thing I definitely want to talk about is sometimes for the listening component, the answer is not going to be just straightforward from the recording that is played. That is what I have faced during my exam. So from the recording, you get a statement and you have to see which, and there were certain words that were given for me. So you have to see which word actually describes that statement, and then that word is the answer, not the statement from the recording. So that was kind of tricky because usually you just wait for that keyword to write the answer on and just wait for that. But it might not always happen. So what I had to do for that specific section is actually write down the statements when it is being played, so I can come back and answer the question at hand. Because obviously there are like 5 questions of that sort, and I could not afford to remember everything. So I had to actually write down on the question paper. You are allowed to write down. So I had to write down those sentences that were being played, so I remember those words and I can answer those questions. So that was really tricky.
Now let's move on to reading. You scored band 8, very, very, very respectable score. Talk about your preparation for that section.
Reading. So for reading, it was all passages. So I prepared for GMAT earlier. I mean, not this year, a couple of years ago, but at least I was familiar with having a passage and answer questions after that. So I was kind of prepared for it. But my strategy has always been, I think one of the candidates you interviewed before has already mentioned, I would definitely read the questions first and then go back to the passage, because reading the questions would always help as to where to look for. It definitely helps that way, because once you start reading the passage first, you just tend to get carried away, and for me, I would still worry about the questions after that. So I would not be paying attention to what is actually in the passage unless I know what I have to be looking for. So that has definitely helped. Read the questions first and then go back to the passage.
So now let me see, though, you're advising to read all of the questions per section. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so you read through all of the questions once. You go through the passage, and then do you stop reading as you come to the answers in the questions, or do you read through the entire passage?
I do stop. So once I have all the questions, I start reading the passage. So if I think this could be the answer for some question that I've read, so I go back to the questions and see which actually fits where. So if I think I read the question again, so probably this could be the answer for the first question. Okay. So that is how I go about.
Okay. Yeah. So it's interesting to share different strategies, because a couple of people I've talked to now followed the strategy where they would read one question and then go and find the answer, or they would read 2 questions and then go and find the answers for those 2 questions. And it sounds like your strategy is different. You read all of the questions and then you go and as the answers pop out, you punch them into the questions.
Okay. Yes. And one other thing is definitely practicing different types of passages that are likely to come in the essay. I mean, in the examination, because they're not going to be all passages where you have a passage, you have a set of questions, you just have to answer those questions. It's not going to be that way all the time. There are different patterns within the reading component. So I think everyone has to practice all types of reading passages that could come in. That definitely helps too, because I was not familiar with one of the types of reading passages where you have to match the heading or the name of the paragraph to the paragraph in the essay. So I mean, practicing all types of these things would definitely give you more confidence when you're actually writing the exam, that, okay, I know this type of what do you say, the passage, so I think I can answer it. So if you're not familiar with that type of essay, then type of paragraphs that you have in front, so you may freak out a little. So practicing would definitely help.
Okay, now let's talk about your experience in the examination room. How did that go? How did you feel? Were you confident about your performance?
I think reading did not change a lot when it came to what I practiced at home versus what was in the exam theater, because the passages were in front of me. I had to write the answers. But one thing the examiners always kept us reminding about, they keep reminding you during the examination that you don't have additional time to to your answer to the answer sheet. So you have to make sure that you have enough time to copy all your answers to the answer sheet. So that's one thing, because after the listening test, one might think you have some additional listening is what was given, but you would not get that additional time at the end of the reading section. So you have to be sure that you are copying all your answers into the answer sheet within the time.
What was the examination room like? Was it a place that made you feel comfortable?
Yes, it was similar to a classroom, but obviously, I think we had like two people sharing the same bench. So there were like 4 people in a row altogether. We had enough space between each candidate, so it was not very uncomfortable there. But one thing to prepare for is, I guess, if the exam environment, if your benches are not really individual and you have to share a bench with another candidate, there may be a probability where the other candidate is trying to use an eraser to erase one of his answers and is literally shaking the bench off. That has happened to me. I'm like, okay, you need not use all that pressure.
Right.
That definitely hurts the other candidate who's trying to focus. It happens a lot for the writing section more than anything, because someone writes a sentence, tries to erase that off and correct them.
The more I talk to people, the more people are sharing, stories of things that do distract you, and it's something that actually I think people should be aware of, and just be prepared that these sorts of things may come up, because it can affect your mark. I mean, if somebody's erasing something when a critical part of the listening is playing, and it just distracts you that little bit and you miss it, it's the difference between one band and another. So, and then I guess when you left the examination room, did you feel pretty confident about the performance?
Yes, I should say yes. I did not expect 8.5. That was definitely way above, but I thought I could easily score 7.5 in each of them. So I was confident on that regard. I was like, okay, fine. I think I did fairly well.
Okay. Sarojini, is there anything else you wanted to share about reading before we go to writing?
No, nothing that I can think of. It's just preparing yourself for various types of passages, and then making sure that you time yourself very well. So timing is important. That is what I did when I was taking the mock tests at home. Time yourself. And you have a lot of time, that is true, but I would try to finish it much before the scheduled time. So I have enough time to review what I did, and or at least come back to those questions that I was doubtful before, so I can actually spend more time on that.
And did you spend any time doing specific vocabulary training?
Frankly speaking, I think I did not have the need to.
Yeah.
There would be probably just a couple of words that maybe I'm not
Right.
really familiar with, and I would just try
Yeah.
to look up. Or most times, even if it is an unfamiliar word, given the context of the passage or the context of the what would actually the situation, you would automatically follow what it intends to say. So that is how I would go about, and probably there are like 2 or 3 words like that when I prepare, not a lot of them.
You scored 8.5 in writing, which is something that so rarely happens. Why don't you just walk us through the entire process, from the moment that you learned about how the exam is structured in writing to the examination itself?
Okay. One might feel really weird when I say about how I prepared for writing and speaking, but this is exactly what I did. So for writing, I did not actually sit and write the essays a lot of times. I only wrote just a couple. I think for the letters or the first writing task one, I spent like probably 3 times I wrote, and for the task two, maybe 2 or 3 times, and not really more than that. But one thing I definitely found in the writing task, since I took general, most topics were actually very general topics. For me, writing a sentence was not a problem, but getting the idea to write that sentence was a problem. So I had to spend some time to think what I want to write rather than just start writing. So my preparation was to read a lot for the writing section. I mean, it might sound really weird, but I had to increase my knowledge database on different topics. Say, the topics were really very general. Say, it could be online advertisements, or how advertisements impact the children, or how do you think online shopping is beneficial. So they're all centered about advertisements, for instance. So I wanted to be sure I could write something if a topic like that comes up. So for writing task one, I spent at least good 5 minutes thinking what I want to write. I would not start writing immediately. So I want to make sure I have really strong points or really convincing points to be sure that I can start my essay or the task one. So that is where I would spend most of my time. So I want to be sure I'm writing what I want to write, and be sure that this is a very good point, and feel confident about it. So that is how I would start. At least for task one, I would spend at least 5 minutes thinking what I want to write. And depending on what the topic is, the first paragraph is always going to be introduction. The next paragraph is probably going to be what they want me to convey in that task one, and then concluding. So 150 words is not really that hard when you would start writing something. So introduction would easily take 50 words, and then you have 2 more paragraphs to write about 150 words, 100 words. So that's how I would frame. So first paragraph on the introduction, next on the topic, next on the conclusion. So that's what I did for task one. When it came to, I think for when I wrote the exam, the task one was about me applying for a college, and I submitted the application, but they had not responded. So they wanted me to write a letter to the admissions department on the status of my application, and explaining why I like their college, and let them know why I need a faster response from them. So that was my task one topic. So when I wrote the letter, the first paragraph, as I said, I introduced myself. So made sure that there was my name, the college name, the course name, and also when you submit an application, you get an application reference ID usually. So I just listed a random application reference ID. So that was basically my first introduction paragraph. And then I went about writing the next topic that they told me to speak about, why I like their college. So there has to be a reason why I specifically chose their college. So I had to just say things like infrastructure, or the class background. I mean, the different backgrounds that they bring in. So I just explained why their college interests me. And for the next thing I had to speak about was why I need a response sooner. So I just, since it was kind of applicable, since I was actually working, so I just mentioned about that I was planning to take vacation for the duration of the course. So unless I'm actually picked for the course, I don't really need that vacation. So I need a faster response so I could get my vacation approved. That was exactly what I wrote for my task one when it came up.
It's interesting that you highlight the importance of creativity in task one, which I think is something that people that are planning to take the general should keep in mind, because the letter, out of all of the writing tasks that you could receive, general or academic, the task one general definitely challenges you to come up with some details that make the situation of the letter believable.
Right. I think my preparation for GMAT, as I mentioned earlier, probably helped here. Because I submitted application forms. I was waiting to hear back from a college back then. So, and since I was actually working, I thought I could bring that environment. So what if I have to really join a course right now? I would need vacation from my work. I would need approvals. So that is what I just put in the task one.
Interesting. Now, how about task two?
So for task two, I was very worried about my task two because writing 250 words is not easy, especially when everything has to make sense. You cannot just put some words in there and say, okay, I'm done with task two. So since you could go a little overboard, as in you don't have to stick yourself to 250 words, that was kind of a relief. But nevertheless, you cannot really go overboard and write too much, above 300 words, say, for example. There is not a restriction, but I always focus on quality rather than quantity. So it's not like you have a huge essay right in front. Even the examiner would get distracted, is what I feel. Unless you keep your task to the point, write what you have to, and stay focused. Only then you would have the examiner's attention too. It's if you have too many words out there, I think you would lose the attention from them as well.
Absolutely.
So that was my target. And for task two, I would, just like task one, I would spend at least 10 minutes of the time just to think what I want to write. So the task two is usually a statement out there, and you have to think about both sides of the coin and then probably give your viewpoint. That is how most of the task twos are. So I would spend at least 10 minutes to come up with 3 good points for pros and 3 good points for cons. So at least 3. And if I get 3 even before 10 minutes, then I would still think as to if I can find even a better point or even a stronger point than what I have out there. So that's where the whole of task 2 depends for me. Once I have the points that I want to write on, it's just about framing the sentences and supporting what I want to write. So writing a sentence has never been a problem for me, but since coming up with ideas to frame that essay, that has always been a problem. So even I think for the task 2, most topics are very general. It could be a topic related to your everyday. You would probably come across those topics, but when you have to actually sit and write, it may not be that easy. Advertising, as I brought up, so that is a very common topic. You see advertisements each time you switch on your TV, but when you actually have to write something about advertisements, where you have to write at least 3 points for defending it and 3 points against it, it is not easy, because for me, coming up with examples is also very important to defend what I want to write. And I've read somewhere that if you could write some examples from your own experience, it's even beneficial. So that's how I would think when for the first 10 minutes. If I have some pros and cons, if there is a way I could fit in an example from my real life, if there is anything that I could add, which would enhance my writing task too, and make it more realistic and more attracting to the examiners. So when I think my task 2 was related to advertisements. I cannot exactly recall what the topic was, but it was related to how advertise. I think I recall the topic now. So for advertising, it said. How advertising plays an important role in your everyday life, as well as how certain individuals you tend to buy certain products which are not really needed, but you're just watching the advertisement and you go about buying that product. So discuss pros and cons, and discuss what is your view on it. This was the topic I received. So I spent, as I said, about 10 minutes thinking what I want to write. I mean, it's not really a tough topic when you think of it, but you want to make sure that your essay is really good. So for prose, I think I gave examples from my own. The first paragraph, as I said, sorry, I want to go in the order, was always an introduction. I would not actually state what I want to defend on and write in the first paragraph, because if I state what I want to defend, so the examiner would read the essay with that viewpoint in mind. So I don't want to reveal anything until the end. So to
But
keep them.
do you make some sort of declaration at the beginning, though, that you will be coming to some sort of conclusion based on what you're going to be looking at in the essay?
Yes, right, definitely. So it's just going to be a general introduction. How, say, advertising plays a very important role in your day-to-day life or whatever. So I've always prepared myself for one catchy line at the beginning, just to get the attention, or just to give a feel to the examiner that there is going to be some real good content in my essay. That's so the first introduction paragraph is very important in that case. So I would just talk about advertising. I would just say, okay, some people get good out of it, some people get bad out of it. So it's there is a balance where people have to draw what is relevant to them or something like that. So that's how my introduction paragraph is going to be. And then I would talk about its pros as to how advertising would really help. Say, you would not know of a new product if there was no advertising at all on it, unless you visit to the store or come across that product. So I spoke about that, and I gave a real example from my own life where I said I did not know about Zumba until I found an advertisement on Zumba in the TV when I was switching channels. So that's how I got to know Zumba, and I told that I was practicing Zumba for the last 1.5 years. So that was a positive example I gave, that it changed my life and had a positive impact on me. That was one thing. And for the cons, I think I mentioned about how advertising could lead you to buying unnecessary products that you don't really need. So I gave an example from my own life again, where I saw a product being advertised on TV. It was so tempting. It was so, it's so much, it gives you a feel that that is the right product for you. And when you use a product, either weight loss or skincare or whatever it is, it would do the good for you. So, and you would, I went ahead and bought the product only to realize there could be side effects for it, which the advertisements usually do not say when they're playing the ad out there. So that's how I went about talking about how playing just viewing the advertisements would not do good, but unless you actually know the product and know what you're buying and think if it is really needed for you. So I came up with the points for writing, but when it comes to preparation, all I did was read a lot. So I went through a lot of tasks to essays, because I wanted to be sure I could come up with topics to write. Advertising, at least, is a generic topic, but there could be so many other topics that you think you know, but when you have to write 250 words, you may not be able to come up with so many topics or so many points to write about. So I went about reading. I think I have read at least easily about 150 to 200 task to essays.
Wow.
Yeah, just to, I would not read them as a model essay to be sure that I want to write an essay like that, because you never know if it was a band 8 essay or a band 6 essay.
Right.
So it was not for framing the essay, but to get those key points that were written in the essay, that I could use these points and write my own sentences. So I would, just for the center points, I've read at least 150 to 200 essays easily.
Now, Sarojini, if I could cut in here for 1 second. So how central do you think the idea of cohesion was in your response on the task 2? Because you mentioned that you give a very clear introduction that sets up a sort of plan for the rest of the essay. Why don't you talk about the way that you used cohesion in the other sections of the essay, so the supporting paragraphs and your conclusion?
Right. So when I was writing about the supporting paragraphs, the first paragraph was explaining what I just told in my introduction, that we would be discussing this and the rest of the essay. So I started with giving some examples, giving some ideas, and then supporting examples for it. The words however, but also, these play a kind of important role where you are explaining a topic and you want to give a side effect to that topic or a counteracting point to that. So that's how I started my next paragraph, saying, however, you have these points as well. So that was my cons paragraph. But both these paragraphs, for my essay, I just divided the pros into one, and then pros and examples into one, and cons and examples into the second paragraph, into the third, I should say, into the third paragraph, and then there was a conclusion paragraph. Where I just made sure that although there are pros and cons, I think I used a statement there, just like there are two sides for a coin, advertising also has both sides, and it depends on an individual on how you would perceive an advertisement and go about doing anything with it.
I see. So your conclusion did not choose one side or the other. It was more of a balance between the two.
Yes.
Okay, I see. And just you were mentioning about your supporting paragraph. So you had one paragraph that was looking at the positive sides of advertising, one that was looking at the negative sides of advertising. In the final sentence or two of those supporting paragraphs, were you concluding the idea in any way, or connecting it to some sort of central theme that was running through the essay?
I think I did. I cannot exactly recall right now. Just to be sure that I was not going off topic or explaining a paragraph that is totally not choosing a link between what the original statement is. I did say a sentence where I cannot exactly recall at the moment, but there was definitely a sentence where it said what I actually mentioned in my introduction paragraph, that advertising has both positives and negatives associated with it. So I think the statement was this is not limited to, but there are several other positive impacts of advertising. But just like I mentioned, there are also negative effects that we have to examine or we have to analyze. So that's how I got a link to the introduction, and then link to the next supporting paragraph on the negatives of it.
I see. Okay, well, it sounds like it was a very straightforward 4-paragraph essay. You had you started by declaring that there was the progression of the entire essay. You looked at both sides. You came to minor conclusions that helped you come to a more major conclusion, which is that there was a balance between the positive and the negatives. Now, I have to ask you the question: what do you think held you back from Band 9?
For the writing, I really believe it's probably the writing itself. I do really write well. My handwriting is usually good. But when it came to writing down with a pencil, I did practice writing essays, but I did not actually practice with a pencil. I practiced with a pen. So when it came to writing, I think I started writing down the essays, but then the paragraphs. Then I realized I didn't want to go too much over the 250 words because I just wanted to be sure I just had hit 250 and then had a couple of words or probably even a paragraph out there, which is okay. So I think I started writing and then I did erase a couple of times to restructure the sentence. So maybe the handwriting was not really legible, is what I think.
Now, and then just the point that you make about aiming for 250 and just going slightly over it, I think you're really helping to dispel this myth that a lot of candidates have. I think they believe that Band 8.5, Band 9 is only awarded to students that can write very, very well at 300 words and above.
Right. I mean, I totally believe in what you said, Ryan, because I don't think writing a 300 plus word essay would just give you a good score. For me, the quality is important,
Absolutely.
not the quantity. So I don't want to write less than 250 because that's not going to do any good to me. It would probably take a few marks, which is not good. So I need to hit the target 250, but it's very hard to just stick to 250, 260. So you can go a few words above it, but you don't need to target at 300. I've seen people where they've taken additional sheets of paper to write the essay. I really thought, okay, you could fit a 300-word essay in the sheets that is given. I mean, it differs from person to person. If your handwriting is really big and you go overboard, that is fine. But if you really think writing more is going to do you good, I think you're just going to lose the concentration of the examiner who's actually reading your essay, which is not going to do you any good. So you have to stick to the main point. You have to stick to the word limit and try to get the point across as straight as you can.
Is there anything else that you wanted to share about writing?
So as I said, first, good 10 minutes just to think what you want to write.
Right.
So most people would just start writing and then see how the flow goes. But that's not how I want to do it. Spend good 10 minutes, think what you want to write, then spend the next 20 to 25 minutes writing and practice with a pencil, of course, because that has been my hurdle. The pencil nib would just break and I got irritated a couple of times because I'm not used to that. So that's so spend good 20-25 minutes writing the essay and leave at least 5 to 10 of your last minutes to just read what you have written. You might want to make some changes, or you might want to, since it's a pencil, you always have a chance to correct what you've written. So just give the last, I definitely want everyone to read what they have written. Most times there could be a simple spelling mistake, which you would not notice because you are in a hurry to write down the point and you might just miss. And most people are sitting in front of the systems and practicing. So some systems may even autocorrect the spellings for them.
Right.
So when you're writing the essay all by yourself, I would give the last 5 to 10 minutes to read every word and to put your mind when you're reading, because your mind says the spelling is right, but you did not actually write what you thought you wrote. So it's very important to read the word, read what is right there in front of you.
Okay, well then let's move on to the speaking, and you scored absolutely amazing 8.5. I am sure that your 3 years in the US committed a lot to that mark. You know, it's not just enough to live in an English-speaking country. You also have to be familiar with the way that the examination is conducted, and you know what sort of responses are going to get you good marks. Why don't you talk a little bit about the preparation strategy that you went through for your speaking?
Okay, for writing and speaking, I did most of reading to prepare myself because for me, framing a sentence was not an issue, but I needed to know about the topic to talk about it. So as part of preparation, I went through several examples of speaking module, as in the topics are going to be very general again. So it could be your neighborhood or a city or a country or even a vacation place, hobby. The topics are centered around the general hub of topics. So I just wanted to make sure that I knew I could talk about them if a topic like that comes up. Say, as part of practicing, so if it is on neighborhood, so what would I say if I have to talk about my neighborhood? That is how I prepared. And if it's a hobby that I have to explain, or a game that I'm fond of, so which game do you think I want to talk about? So that is how I concentrated and prepared. Okay, I would want to talk about this game, and this is how probably explain the game or go about that. So that is how I prepared. If it is a person that I want to talk about who influenced me or motivated me, so which person would that be? So I actually started thinking about the topics because you do get about a minute or so to prepare during the exam, but if the topic is fairly new to you that you have not thought about it at all, it's very hard to come up and speak for 1.5 minutes continuously. So that's not going to be easy. I think one topic that was very common and that I probably did not focus on was on museums and national history. So I was like, okay, if I were asked to talk about the museum, what would I say? I have not visited the museum since I was a child, when I was back in India and in Hyderabad. So I really don't know the importance of that museum because it has been so long. I don't even know what that museum holds at this point of time. It's been several years ago. So I thought, okay, fine, I'll have to revisit what that museum is about, what I know about it, so stuff like this. So it's very important to brush up all your fundamentals on the general topics to be sure that you have something to talk about. That is how I started preparing. One important thing, I think this comes just from the speaking exam experience that I've had. Do not be too fast when you're speaking. Just take it, I usually speak really fast. That is what I realized when I was taking my speaking test. So you can convey the same point. Say, for instance, I traveled from India to USA. The same sentence, you could just say, I took a flight from India to USA. It was a 24-hour journey, something like that. So you could kind of go slow and not be too fast, which would eat up all your points and you have nothing to talk about and you still have a few minutes left. I think that was the reason I got an 8.5 versus 9 in speaking. Whatever I wanted to say, I finished in less than a minute. And I still had time left that I could talk. So now that is the roadblock for me. So if you could just take it slow and still speak at a normal pace and not be worried about anything on the time, you could probably ace it.
I'm curious, where were the examples that you mentioned that you I think you said you found some examples online or you found some transcripts. Where were these?
These were on different websites. The sources are all listed in the Target Band 7 book. Okay. I think one was on examenglish.com or Take IELTS on the British Council. And there were several videos out there in the YouTube on how a Band 8 person would speak or how a Band 7 person would speak to an interview situation. So I've seen some of your own videos as well. So it was like listening to them and making sure you know how to respond to them and you know what to speak about. That has been my hurdle all the time. Know what to speak. I can just speak, but I don't know if I would be able to speak on that specific topic. So that was very important.
Tell us about the examiner. Were they from the US?
Yes. They were from the US, and I think the moment I entered, she told me that she was going to record my entire session. I was like, okay, and she asked me to hand over my passport for verification of the name and asked me to tell my full name. And then she said, okay, the first few minutes I'm just going to talk to get to know you, and then we could go into the speaking part later on. So she just asked me a few questions on where I was from and if I was working or studying and if I liked my job and how would it be, how was it on the first day of your job? Do you still recall that day? And how has your experience been so far? So it was related to this thing in the speaking part 1. And she even brought up memories. Do you like taking photographs or something on those lines about photography? She did bring that topic up in speaking part 1. And in the speaking part 2, the question for me was, the topic for me was to talk about an item that I brought during my visits to any other country or any place. She asked me to talk about one specific item that I brought and describe when was it brought, where was it brought, and what is the item that you brought. So as I said, I mean, you could definitely talk about 1.5 to 2 minutes easily on this, but I was really fast when I was talking. So I think that was the reasons I just finished everything that I wanted to say, and I'm like, okay, I'm done, and the time is not yet done. So I had to come up with something else and start. I think the examiner got that I was trying to make something up because I'm done speaking whatever I was prepared for. So it's very important that you just take it slow. So I think for my speaking test, I spoke about a painting that I brought in Maldives, and I told when we traveled, how we traveled to that place, and why did I purchase that specific painting, and what did that painting describe, and what I wanted to be reminded of when I saw that painting. So this is what I went about talking. And when we moved to the speaking part 3 for the follow-up questions, it was mostly around how it was related to photography and technology. So the follow-up questions were on do you think taking photographs helps in reminding memories, or do you think you should just have them in your memory and just feel the happiness? So it started with that question, and then we went about how technology could replace human memory. So do you support it? Do you think technology will replace, or what do you think that technology cannot do that human memory can do? So that's how it went about.
I see. And the transition from part 2 to part 3, was it fairly natural? Was it awkward?
It was natural. I think there were related questions throughout, starting with the photography and taking photographs with friends, taking photographs with occasions, and then it went on to the technology part of it, with technology and human memory.
Okay, very interesting. And so when you finished the examination, did you leave the exam room feeling quite confident about the speaking?
Yes, I was pretty confident in the way I spoke, but the only concern I had was I finished speaking early than the scheduled time.
I see.
And I realized I could have done much better if I were a little slow. Just a little. I could have easily made up those 30 seconds or how many seconds were left. But that was the only part I was a little skeptical. But otherwise, I was pretty confident that I did really well, because she looked very interested in what I was speaking. So, and she was either through the head nods or a little yes, or whatever those little gestures are. So that told me that she was interested in what I was speaking, and I was not just talking out aloud and in the air. And one thing to definitely keep in mind is to be natural, just take it out, and you don't have to sound like a person that you're not. So just be what you are. If you are given a topic, whatever you know about it. So I think I even brought out an example of Malaysian Airlines 370 that disappeared for 5 months ago now. I did bring up that topic because it was related to technology and human memory. So I said, if I were to talk about the MH370 now, I would just say, yeah, it went missing. It started from here to there and stuff, but I may not be able to speak to every details of it. So the technology out there would tell me everything that has happened since day one. So if it has all the information out there, not just 4 months ago, I could pull up something related to even a few years ago. But if you depend on human memory, I may not be able to recollect all of it. And I also said there is a downside to it. If technology would not tell you the tone. So if I were to share, there would be a difference between how I would say a story of MH370 missing. So I would definitely put feelings and emotions into what I speak, but technology would not do that. So that's how I went about speaking.
I see. And it sounds as though examples were quite central to your speaking responses.
Yeah, so I just I probably a little lucky to get a topic like that where I could bring in an example from the real world. But when the 1 minute topic is given, if you could think of something, I don't think you can actually think of something in the 1 minute time you're given, because it's actually with the follow-up questions that come up where you would talk. But if you could think of an example from the real world, I'm guessing that would definitely impress the examiner, because you are not just saying it is important or not just taking a stand on something, but you're explaining with an example, just like how we did in the writing section, probably from your own life. So that definitely helps.
What did you write on your paper in preparation for your response?
I answered all the questions in the question paper, actually. So the first part, when did you travel? So, about 3 months ago. And then when I also just put, how did I travel to? We took a flight to so-and-so place, and it was a 3-hour journey, whatever. So I just wrote those keywords: flight, 3 hours, 3 months ago, 4 months ago. And then the next topic was which place did we go to? So I was like, okay, it is Maldives, Malay. So that's the country name. Okay, I got that right. So that is all I can write to it. And then what is that one thing that you picked up from that place? So I wrote, okay, I have to come up with something. So it was a painting. And then I wanted to describe it. So I wrote few keywords, like what was in that painting, starting with blue waters, a sunset, and water villas in the background. So I wrote these 3 keywords out there.
Sorry, go ahead.
And then when I started speaking, I went in the same order. I didn't want to miss out the order of the questions and speak on the way around or mix up. So I just went in the same order, and then I started. The last one where I was describing about the painting, that is where I went by the keywords and spoke about each one of them. So this picture had the blue waters, and this is a speciality of Maldives, and started speaking about that painting as a whole.
I see.
And that is where I wanted to make sure that I covered the time up, but seems like I just finished it ahead of time. I would say just listen to various speaking tests that are out there in the YouTube for how you would see a band 7 person speaking, band 9 person speaking, and see where you think you would fall under. So if you think you're a band 7 person and you want to be like a band 9 person, so how are they speaking? What is the difference? I mean, paying attention to those minute details would definitely help.
Sarojini, thank you very much for coming on the show today, and congratulations on your IELTS success.
Thank you so much. It was really nice talking to you. I'm just hoping that something out of all this helps some students out there who are practicing for IELTS and want to ace the exam.
Thank you for downloading from IELTS.com. Have you achieved an overall band of 7 or higher on the IELTS exam? Why not contribute to the podcast? Contact Ryan at his blog, IELTS.com.